When first generation Ryzen CPUs were released, they made a breakthrough because of how much better they were compared to the FX series and how compelling they were compared to Intel's just released Kaby Lake offerings. In many ways, even the current processors are still similar to these seemingly aging CPUs. They usually have the same amount of performance cores, similar TDP and power consumption, and many of them share the same socket. Even if we look at the latest Steam hardware survey, we can clearly see that 6-core CPUs are still the most popular choice amongst gamers in particular, and, well, both the newest and the oldest Ryzen 5 CPUs have this exact amount. Bringing up the question, is Ryzen 5 1600 still a good CPU in 2024? I have a Ryzen 5 1600 AF, a slightly newer version of this CPU, making it a tiny bit more powerful and power efficient compared to the original release. I will test it in an average modern day system to see if it can keep up inside of it. The CPU will work with an RX 5700 XT, an older GPU too, but the one which is very close in performance to an RTX 3060, which is the current most popular graphics card. Starting off with the gaming test, Cyberpunk, an Ultra preset, runs at about 50 frames per second. My main CPU, Core i5-10600KF, runs the game with about 5 more frames per second than the Ryzen. Things go a bit differently for the Ryzen 5 though. Ryzen 5 1600 on ultra settings gets 55 to 60 frames per second, while Core i5 falls behind noticeably, hitting about 40. Most likely this has happened due to the weather difference in game. On the very low settings, and at 1024 by 768 resolution, Ryzen has gotten 130 FPS, i5 190, which shows the actual difference between the CPUs much better. GTA 5. On ultra settings it drops into the high 40s in terms of frame rate, and the GPU is clearly not used a lot. Core i5 mostly fixes that, giving much higher load to the GPU, boosting the FPS noticeably. On the lowest settings, Ryzen gets about 80 FPS, Core i5 110. PUBG, ultra settings. Ryzen runs the game with about 70 frames per second, though the frame time can be rough when the game loads in or it gets very intensive, like when driving. Core i5 gets a slightly higher frame rate generally, but it does so with much less stuttering. On the lowest settings, Ryzen has managed to get 80 to 100 FPS, Core i5 about 120. Red Dead Redemption 2 Ultra preset. Ryzen gets approximately 50 frames per second, Core i5 just a few frames more. In both cases, the game runs well, and on the lowest preset Ryzen gets 90 FPS, while Core i5 130. Silent Hill 2 High settings, FSR set to balanced. Both CPUs run the game almost identically at these settings, and when everything is set to the lowest settings, Ryzen gets 80 FPS, Core i5 110. Minecraft 1.20, a custom-built, heavily modded version of the game. Ryzen runs it at 75 frames per second, with heavy stuttering when new chunks have to load. Core i5 gets about 100 frames per second, with much less severe drops. From the gaming benchmarks, we can see that this Ryzen can still mostly handle the current most popular graphics card, but something a bit weaker, like an RTX 2060 or an RX 5600, would be the most powerful non-bottlenecked pairing. Also, this CPU already is not capable of officially running Windows 11. You still can with workarounds, and it does work fine, but it might not be possible at all to run Windows 12 on Zen 1 CPUs when that releases. Real world performance is still solid on this CPU. It runs basic tasks very well, apps open quickly, and even when more demanding tasks are concerned, it can still handle them unless you're working with extremely heavy files or big projects. Photoshop works well, basic video editing in Premiere Pro or DaVinci Resolve also works fine, but when you get into color correction or heavy effects, it does start to fall back much more than newer processors do. As I've said, performance difference is also noticeable compared even to the CPUs a few years newer in demanding tasks. While it is not critically slower and things still run well enough for now, if you come back to the Zen or Zen Plus architecture from the latest series of chips, you will feel the difference, shown by the Geekbench 6 benchmarks. Ryzen 5 1600 scores about 4800 points in multi-core benchmark. Core i5 10600KF in my system scores 7000, and the latest 5 series CPUs have roughly double the performance of my main processor. In conclusion, this CPU does indeed hold up well, considering its age. It can mostly handle even the current most popular graphics card, though once again, you should pair it with something a bit simpler, all while still being a decently capable CPU in general, even when compared to the newer processors. Should you buy one today? If you have to build a PC within $250 budget, then it is a worse option to look into, since it only costs about $25 used today, and the AM4 socket will still allow you to upgrade the CPU in the future. For $50 you can buy a cheap AM4 motherboard, which can just about handle Ryzen 5 series CPUs, but for under $100 you can easily find a solid B chipset board, in which you can easily put something like a Ryzen 7 5800X3D in the future. A CPU which is about 2 times faster than the Ryzen we took a look at today.